Concern for man and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors, in order that the creations of our mind shall be a blessing and not a curse to mankind. So said Albert Einstein to his colleagues in 1931. But before the decade was out, scientists in Nazi Germany would develop many new weapons of war. By 1943, Luftwaffe research resulted in the Arado Ar 234. Known as the Blitz, the new jet-powered bomber brought aerial warfare to a completely new level. Able to fly higher and faster than any Allied aircraft, the Ar 234 was well suited to reconnaissance and became the precursor to modern-day U-2s and SR-71s. On the battlefield, the ability to observe and predict enemy movement has always been crucial. With the advent of balloons like this World War I Coquette, skilled observers were carried high above the trenches to see across enemy lines. More sophisticated lighter-than-air vehicles like the massive Zeppelin took the art of aerial reconnaissance one step further. But balloons and airships were extremely vulnerable, so conventional aircraft were soon put to use. And with the advent of aerial photography, positions deep inside enemy lines could be captured on film and taken back for analysis. But reconnaissance aircraft were lightly armed, and losses were high. When war once again erupted in Europe, Nazi columns knew exactly what to expect, because enemy positions were pinpointed well before the battle began. Observation from the air took on myriad forms, including the Luftwaffe's Fiesler Storch. Since it was able to land and take off just about anywhere, the Germans used a Storch to free Mussolini from his mountain prison in 1943. The two-seat plane was an aerodynamic marvel, equipped with a variety of high-lift devices, such as fixed full-span leading-edge slots, full flaps, and large control surfaces. Bulging side windows that gave its two crewmen the best possible view. The Henschel parasol-winged HS-126 was a much heavier aircraft. Often assigned to ground units, the 126 was the Luftwaffe's first all-metal, short-range reconnaissance plane and flew extensively on the Russian front. More compact was the Foch Achilles rotor kite, providing an elevated observation platform for submariners at sea. Barely capable of lifting a single person, its simplified helicopter rotor provided lift and control as the U-boat pulled the kite into the air. But perhaps the most bizarre observation plane tested by the Luftwaffe was Blum and Voss's asymmetric V-141. A creation of Dr. Richard Vogt, the aircraft was meant to serve as a light observation and bombing platform. Modestly successful, the plane saw some action on the Eastern Front in 1941. For balance, the oddly placed cockpit was offset by the engine torque. This actually worked pretty well. Not to be left behind, the Allies were hard at work on observation and reconnaissance aircraft of their own. It paid off with the British all-wood de Havilland Mosquito. The Mosquitoes flew very fast and very high, making refined aerial cameras a real necessity. This plywood flying machine destroyed some 600 V-1 flying bombs and was so swift only one plane was lost for every 2,000 sorties. U.S. reconnaissance efforts, like Lockheed's F-5 P-38 Lightning, were equally capable. Sophisticated, high-resolution cameras mounted in the plane's nose meant that timely information flowed constantly from the front. Images of enemy activity kept Allied commands updated on a daily and even hourly basis. In-field processing of the film provided quick information to commanders during the course of battle. The art of reconnaissance had come a long way from the days of the observation balloon. The Lightning was an ideal platform for the cameras it carried. Fast, steady, and maneuverable, it was capable of flying exceptionally long distances. The plane's twin engines gave pilots reassurance that their single-engine brethren could only dream about. The Lightning was large, with a roomy nose compartment, and could carry a good deal of photographic equipment into the air. The plane normally packed 50 caliber machine guns in its spacious nose compartment, which seemed perfect for cameras, where away from the engines, they shook less and produced clearer photographs. In Germany, the Focke-Wulf FW-189 Owl was used as a short-range reconnaissance aircraft and worked in close cooperation with ground forces. It was purpose-built with extensive glazing for excellent all-round vision for the crew of 3. It operated mainly on the Eastern Front. The Dornier Do-335 Arrow was originally slated for high-speed offensive bombing, but was a natural reconnaissance aircraft that could outpace anything set to catch it. What made it unique was the plane's unusual combination of both pusher and puller propellers. It was the fastest piston-powered machine of the war. Heinkel's HE-280 heralded a new age of possibilities in aerial reconnaissance. With the production of viable jet engines, performance took a quantum leap forward. These revolutionary engines would enable reconnaissance aircraft to cruise over enemy territory with impunity for the very first time. Though the HE-280 made its mark in history as the world's first jet fighter to fly, it would fail in its bid against Messerschmitt's extraordinary Me-262. The first jet fighter in combat, this shark-shaped killer was 100 miles an hour faster than any Allied plane. Behind the 262's success was the Junkers Jumo 004, the world's first jet engine ever to enter production. Though admittedly cantankerous, it produced nearly 2,000 pounds of thrust. In spite of a lifespan measured in tens of hours, it was state-of-the-art for its day. Sharing the supply of Jumo engines was the new Arado 234 reconnaissance jet. Erich Sommer was one of the first to take it into action.
I was sitting in this beautiful bird there. It was a fantastic machine. A skin they plastered on, they told me 150 pounds of speckle just to get every wrinkle out of the surface, yeah. Wonderful visibility to the side. Down there you could look between your legs. For reconnaissance runs it was an ideal machine.
Germany's military machine rose out of the ashes of the First World War. Hitler planned to build a Reich to last 1,000 years. As a frightened world watched, Luftwaffe formations began to fill the skies. Germany's aviation industry grew fantastically. Contractors spewed forth a flood of aircraft. Bombers, fighters, trainers, and transports rolled off assembly lines. In spite of the limitations imposed by the Versailles Treaty, production rates soared, and Germany's people, now back at work, saw Adolf Hitler as their most beloved leader in memory. Companies like Arado churned out planes by the hundreds, some under license, some of their own design. They included the AR-195 torpedo bomber and the 198 reconnaissance aircraft. The Arado 231 could be dismantled stored in a 6.5-foot diameter tube and used by submariners to check for targets beyond the periscope's visual range. The AR-240 was an advanced combat aircraft incorporating such features as a tail-mounted air brake. Its duties included high-speed reconnaissance. The program terminated as a result of political pressure in December 1942. With bizarre landing gear, Arado's AR-232 was the Luftwaffe's attempt to replace the venerable Ju-52 tri-motor transport. Nicknamed the Millipede, the AR-232 was equipped with 11 idler wheels to bear the weight of the aircraft during loading and unloading. But the most advanced production aircraft by war's end was the jet-propelled 234. From stem to stern, it was an aircraft of extraordinary beauty. Its Junkers Umo 004 turbojet engines were state-of-the-art and mounted below the wing for easy access. Each Umo had a small gasoline starter engine, which could be started electrically from the cockpit or manually by pulling a D-ring mounted in the intake bullet. Another means of turning over the Umos was a gasoline-powered unit which accelerated the turbines up to ignition RPM. The disadvantage was that only one engine could be started at a time. The 234 was initially launched from a T-shaped, three-wheel reusable trolley. 3 huge manual jacks raised the aircraft high enough to position the trolley underneath. High-speed taxi trials of the setup were successful, and the decision was taken to go ahead with actual flight testing.
The trolley stayed on the ground, and you jumped out. And at the same time, when the brake lines broke to the trolley, because I was connected with play lines to the 2 drums on the right and left side, yeah. They broke, and at the same time a parachute on the trolley was released to break off the trolley, because I had to use it afterwards again. They were made to measure, or adjusted to measure for each aircraft. So I had to have a good conditioned trolley again afterwards.
But not all trolley tests went well. The skid provided a firm, suitable means of returning the plane to Earth. Landing runs were of normal length. But once airspeed died down, the jet invariably rolled to one side. The hydraulically retractable main skid was mounted on the aircraft's centerline, with 2 retractable outriggers under the engines. The trolley had brakes on each main gear, a castering nose wheel, and quick release mechanisms. In some tests, the trolley landing gear was fixed, but proved too heavy for the jet and performance worsened. Some landings resulted in near disaster. Because of the trolley's high center of gravity, control was easily lost and damage often resulted. The trolley's brakes were not very dependable, and they were also sensitive to a pilot with heavy feet. During test landings and all takeoffs, the trolley's balloon-like tires acted as shock absorbers for the heavy machine. Not built for the punishment of landing, this trolley breaks up on the rough ground at the end of the landing strip.
You have to know what your ground is like before you should put it down on a spot, on a limited spot. That was the idea. They did it so that aircraft can land anywhere. It was a silly idea.
Landing on the skid in primitive conditions wasn't easy. Initial hopes that the trolley system would save both weight and internal space proved unrealistic. Before long, conventional landing gear would have to be designed for the plane. Pilots entered the cockpit through a plexiglass hatch above the seat. The generous use of plexiglass gave Luftwaffe pilots an unparalleled view of the outside world.
Set it up, machine, lined it up, landed on the speed, let it scratch a little bit, let it on the nose, and then like greased lightning on the wet lawn, there was a thunderstorm coming through, and it was like soap. My aircraft didn't break, and I landed in the wheat field. And that was it nearly burned the aircraft because the exhaust jets fired the wheat.
There were distinct advantages and disadvantages to the skid landing gear in the early AR-234s. With it, a pilot could touch down on dirt, grass, snow, ice, almost anywhere. But after that, he had little control and no brakes at all. Keeping the aircraft upright tended to be more a matter of luck than skill. That feeling of helplessness and lack of control often made the final seconds of a landing a nail-biting experience.
Came to a halt, and the crew came with their lifting gear, lifted it up. Tricycle was pushed underneath, locked with a bomb locked, and then with a tractor you were towed away. You were completely immobile with the aircraft alone. You couldn't taxi now. But of course it was a relief after we got our undercarriage.
Nevertheless, hundreds of successful landings on all kinds of surfaces proved the skid functionally practical. In order to quell some of the concerns over braking, several test planes were fitted with a drag chute which deployed as soon as the aircraft hit the ground. Mounted in a ventral canister, the chute did reduce the landing run and was incorporated as a standard feature on all AR-234s to follow. The chute canister had a cable-activated release, controlled from the cockpit. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, brought the Luftwaffe's pressing need for a swift reconnaissance aircraft to crisis point.
So I did the first reconnaissance flight over the invasion front on the 2nd of August, which rates as the first jet reconnaissance flight, operational flight in the world.
The AR-234's speed was everything the Luftwaffe had hoped. As a reconnaissance platform, it was untouchable by Allied fighters. Ironically, one of the new jets was hit by friendly fire on the first mission.
We did the whole invasion front. I did southern England, all the airfields of the southern part of England, or the Americans. Yes, it was like one airfield, the whole area. It was incredible what was built up down there. I bring pictures back that the V1 and the V2 didn't wipe London out and didn't wipe the British resistance out. That was all the time the propaganda of Himmler. Eh? People said, just hold out on the Eastern Front one more week, our wonder weapons will destroy London and England will drop out and the United States will drop out with it. So that was it. And I bring pictures back now. Everything is intact in London. Huh? On the way out, I met a mosquito. A mosquito came this way, I went that way. We could wave one another. He had no weapon, probably I had no weapon. We couldn't do anything.
Exchanging a nod or a wave. Such strange greetings were not uncommon in the skies over Europe. Landings tended to be graceful and well orchestrated. The plane's approach speed was well within most pilots' ability. Touchdown occurred at around 91 miles an hour, with a landing distance of about 1,500 feet. Due to the scarcity of Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines, many having gone to the Messerschmitt 262, Arado turned to BMW for its new 4-engine AR-234. The 4 BMWs provided a higher thrust-to-weight ratio and gave the Blitz a little more power. The new configuration was tested with each engine in its own separate nacelle. But high drag and poor stability led to a simpler arrangement. With 2 engines in each nacelle, the plane was more streamlined than its predecessor. Early uncertainties about the skid gear led Arado to redesign the aircraft with a conventional tricycle arrangement. The resulting AR-234B, slightly larger but otherwise unchanged, had sturdy, retractable landing gear. The heavy-duty nose gear retracted aft, while the main landing gear retracted forward. The main gear well occupied a space that had previously contained a fuel cell. Arado widened the fuselage to make room for the main gear and its retraction assemblies. But the new landing gear was not the panacea the Luftwaffe had hoped. Though it made the plane much more maneuverable on the ground, the track was so narrow that landings and takeoffs became somewhat tricky. Additionally, the oversized tires, built for rough, unprepared airfields, gave the pilot a soft, roller coaster-like ride. But the ability to do away with the cumbersome trolley system and quickly clear the landing areas for returning aircraft made any problems with the new system seem minor. Typical of first-generation jet engines, both the Junkers and BMW power plants were extremely thirsty. Range was always important, and in attempts to extend the Blitz's short time aloft, jettisonable 66-gallon fuel tanks were suspended from racks under the engines. The plane's 814-gallon internal fuel load was carried in 2 flexible rubberized tanks mounted in the fuselage. Maximum range varied between 415 miles at sea level and nearly 1,000 miles at 30,000 feet. The low thrust of the Junkers and BMW turbojets led to excessively long takeoff runs. Accordingly, the plane was often equipped with rocket-assisted takeoff, or RATO units. Each provided an extra 1,100 pounds of thrust and burned out only seconds after leaving the ground. The only known surviving AR-234 at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington is equipped with the RATO units. Essentially a modular power egg with a rocket engine inside, it was used to get a variety of Luftwaffe aircraft off the ground. Complex but reliable, the small rocket's largest component was a ball-shaped propellant tank. In it, 2 propellants, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, ignited upon contact. Stacked RATO units were kept empty and wheeled to a refueling depot on a special dolly. C-Stoff, a water alcohol hydrazine catalyst, was relatively docile and didn't require special handling. T-Stoff, on the other hand, primarily hydrogen peroxide and a stabilizer, was extremely toxic. It was highly acidic and lethal to the touch, and ground crews working with it were forced to wear protective clothing. The units were reusable and came equipped with a small nose-mounted parachute that deployed automatically. The rockets vastly improved jet performance, but once ignited, there was no turning back. They could, however, be jettisoned in an emergency. In normal operation following rocket burnout, the units were jettisoned by the pilot. But they had to release in unison because a hung rocket could send an imbalanced plane out of control. The Arado eggs were then recovered and prepared for reuse in a matter of hours. Following recovery, the Arado units were flushed of propellants by forcing water through with compressed air. Then they were inspected and returned to flight-worthy status and placed in storage. The AR-234 bomber, with 3 bombs and 2 Arado units attached, taxis out to the runway. 1 bomb is mounted under the fuselage, and 1 hangs from each engine nacelle. On these aircraft, equipped with conventional landing gear, a recessed bomb bay replaced the landing skid. This streamlined the plane.
I was only worrying about something when I landed or took off or when I climbed. But when I had a run, nobody could lick me. There was no aircraft, no fighter aircraft who could attack me, because it was not possible to go in a position in this time. We were too fast.
In October 1944, this Blitz was still a novelty. Pilot Horst Goetz is seen preparing for a reconnaissance mission over Allied targets, while the ground crew and casual observers cluster around the plane's transparent nose. The AR-234 was only vulnerable to attack during takeoff or landing. And this did happen. Both American and British fighters claimed AR-234 kills. Most were surprise attacks against unsuspecting Luftwaffe flyers who only realized the danger when it was too late. The plexiglass was just over 2/10 of an inch thick and gave pilots an exceptional forward view. Early AR-234s were almost blind to the rear, however, and were later equipped with an aft-looking periscope. A life-saving innovation, the device gave pilots a chance to avoid surprise attacks from the rear, an invariably fatal experience. The periscope was Erich Sommer's idea.
And this telescope was developed from a Panzer or tank telescope. It is heavy enough, rather for a tank than for an aircraft. But the idea was the pilot can look into the ocular here, and you saw out there above the horizon what is happening up there. Gave you a security that you had a clear sky behind you.
On the ground, it was business as usual for the embattled and outnumbered Luftwaffe crews. Though there appeared little they could do to stem the tide of war, the airmen tried to keep up a facade of optimism. Here, a radio for communicating with airborne comrades is the center of activity. Horst Goetz, on the left here, was one of the elite Luftwaffe pilots assigned to the AR-234. In this candid footage, taken by his fellow pilot and good friend Erich Sommer, Horst and the others put on a carefree face in a time of insanity. Unlike Allied pilots, the men of the Luftwaffe didn't have a rotation system. They flew until death or defeat overtook them. And for all of them, that day was rapidly approaching. With the Allied noose growing tighter, Nazi troops were defending German soil for the very first time. Resistance became bloodier and more fanatical. Losses in men and machines were beyond belief. The Reich was disintegrating in a storm of its own making. Allied bombing attacks leveled cities and laid waste to industry. And the carnage for humanity reached new depths. Allied bombing missions concentrated on Germany's remaining strategic resources. Oil and fuel refineries were sought out by the massive bomber formations. But if fuel supplies were wiped out, the Reich war machine would be brought to its knees. The Germans frantically tried to move factories underground, but by the time they were ready, it was too late. The destruction was total.
From Lüttich, from Liège to the south to the Alps, there was no cover for reconnaissance. So I was transferred to Blitz with my own commando, one aircraft and the whole maintenance crew, and operated from a dreadful airfield. Very soggy, very foggy, bad weather, industrial area to the west, which drifted in the smoke, in the mist. So I operated from there, the whole section between the Alps and Holland.
A Kettenkrad tracked vehicle assigned to Sommer's unit was used at Blitz during the winter of 1944 to collect jettisoned Rato pods. Sommer's covered AR-234 endured heavy snowfalls. Landings and takeoffs from this facility were dangerous because of the narrow slot, leaving no room for human or mechanical failure. The skies above were not always quiet, and the contrails of Allied bombers and fighters, or the twists and turns of a dogfight, were common sights overhead. Meanwhile, Sommer's aircraft remained shrouded in tarpaulin below. During the January of 1945, the snow melted, and operations at Blitz resumed.
Reconnaissance had completely broken down there in Italy, and I was to establish a commando there.
On Christmas Eve 1944, Sommer's AR-234 was destroyed in an Allied air raid. Though the harsh winter of 1944 slowed Allied progress, as the snows melted, their relentless push to victory continued. In northern Italy, the mud was assaulted and sometimes conquered. The hazards appeared to be never-ending. Relief was non-existent, and the hardships at times unendurable. Fighting a battle of desperation, Nazi propagandists continued to spew out lies of hope. But for most, hope had long been lost. AR-234 missions continued unabated. As a bomber, it attacked the Allies at Remagen. The Blitz's speed made it one of the only German weapons left that could operate with relative impunity. Bearing the brunt of fighter duties in an ever-shrinking Luftwaffe was Messerschmitt's Me-262. Fast and effective, the Schwalbe, or Swallow, also proved a difficult target for Allied airmen. Vulnerable only during takeoff and landing, the advanced German jet fighter was, however, too little too late. Germany's infrastructure collapsed before the Allied onslaught. The AR-234 bomber had been delayed, but when it finally did go to war, it was deadly. In her death throes, Nazi Germany launched nearly 3,000 V-2 rockets against England. With impact speeds of nearly 3,800 miles an hour, they were impossible to intercept. The German terror weapons were unquestionably the most advanced in the world. The AR-234, the world's best reconnaissance aircraft, was a source of great pride to the Luftwaffe pilots who flew it. The photographs it provided for the Wehrmacht commanders were superb, and the impunity with which it flew was an embarrassment to the Allies. The major bridges that crossed the Rhine were a primary reconnaissance target for aircraft on both sides. Of course, the 234 wasn't invincible. This one didn't survive. By the spring of 1945, Germany's military might had been crushed, and the Allies were pushing deep into the heart of the Third Reich. The quantity and variety of aircraft found on airfields throughout Europe was simply stunning.
So everybody grabbed German technology and used it. But they had already their own developments. Some German developments were already superseded by developments which were done in England or in America. Nobody had complete control of new stuff.
Recovered aircraft included numerous AR-234s. Under Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe aircraft of greatest technological interest to the Allies, such as the AR-234, were gathered by special British and US recovery teams. It was hoped that studying their technology would improve forthcoming Allied projects. Efforts intensified when it became clear the Russians had exactly the same intention. Those aircraft slated for the United States and Great Britain were flown to Cherbourg in France and prepared for shipment. Among those retrieved by Watson's raiders were two AR-234s already painted in US Army Air Force markings. Later, cocooned for shipment, these Blitzes, along with many other models, were soon making the long transatlantic journey. Among the rarer treasures brought into Cherbourg were a Heinkel 219 night fighter, followed by a single-seat Me-262. Another find, this two-seat night-fighting version of the 262. Distinguished by its array of nose-mounted radar antennae, it was the fastest night fighter of the war. Departing the French coast, ships carrying the captured planes headed for America. The cocooning process protected these Dornier arrows from the salty environment of the exposed deck. Strapped to the deck next to the arrow is a cocooned single AR-234. Today, only one AR-234 survives, as part of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum collection. This aircraft has been completely and meticulously restored. General Fred Ascani was one of the few American pilots privileged to fly the plane.
I had 5 or 6 flights on this aircraft. I enjoyed every one of them once you got the engine started. You felt very comfortable, like sitting in a living room chair. You had a better view than most airplanes. And it can be compared to a helicopter, which I've also flown quite a bit, where you have a bubble canopy and you have tremendous visibility. My recollection of the airplane was it's a very stable aircraft. It was very easy to fly. The greatest problem really was getting the engine started, and you felt 90% of the flight was over once that happened. It exhibited what we call cavitation, and the engines cavitated, which meant they were thrusting you forward and then dropping off. So you sort of went forward. You felt like you were going forward and backward all on the whole time you're on the final approach, the landing. And it's an eerie feeling unless you're aware of it. This airplane could have easily operated as a supplementary anti-bomber aircraft to supplement the ME-262 jet fighters because it had the performance, which of course would provide the kind of performance needed to intercept the bomber formations. So if they'd had this in enough quantities, yes, it made a difference, absolutely. It could have been a very formidable weapon, yes.
After the war, Arado's legacy lived on in many forms. Twin-engine, jet-propelled bombers became de rigueur for military air services across the globe. Most famous of the early offspring was the English electric Canberra, a light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. The Canberra was first flown in 1949. It had 2 crew members and an effective bomb load. Built as bombers, reconnaissance planes, and test beds, the aircraft flew until the 1990s. The United States eventually acquired its own version of the Canberra. It was called the B-57. Built by the Martin Company, it too became a jack of all trades. Made for the US Air Force as a night bomber, it differed from its British counterparts by having 1 crew member sit in front of the other rather than side by side. Special reconnaissance versions were built with extended outer wing panels for increased lift at high altitude. All armament was removed to make the plane lighter. Cameras on many of the big wing B-57s were mounted in a bomb bay, and by the mid-1960s gave photographs taken from 60 miles away the resolution normally achieved from 12 inches. 2 of the planes fly for NASA to this very day. It hasn't flown in nearly half a century, and today only 1 survives. The product of an era of immense suffering and amazing achievement, Arado's AR-234 was a superb reconnaissance platform and a formidable bomber. Named the Lightning, speed was its forte, and frequently its only defense. Like so many other weapons, it embodies the good and evil present in all scientific game. Its intent was violently clear: to enable men to take life with greater efficiency. But its revolutionary jet technology would also serve to enlighten and better the lives of every generation yet to come.